So, Mike, good morning. I came here to London to listen to you with your huge experience in various ministries and situations with crises, many difficult crises. So perhaps the idea would be to share with people some key examples, some key ideas you would have to address the future crisis, and first of all, perhaps to give two or three things about your career, of what you did and what you do.
Okay. I started life as a journalist, long time ago. In fact, just over 25 years ago, I left journalism and I joined government service. In government service, I worked for a number of different ministries. I worked for the Ministry of Employment, then for the Ministry of Energy for 6 years, where I dealt with nuclear, oil, coal, gas and all the problems that might arise from those. Then I went and joined the Metropolitan Police Service, London's police at Scotland Yard, and I was Director of Public Affairs there for 3 years and saw a number of major emergencies handled, including public order, weather, technological accident. I then joined our Department of the Environment, which looked after not only the environment but also the construction industry. I then joined the Home Office, which is the Ministry for Interior and Justice, and which supervises civil emergencies in the United Kingdom. I then moved on, and my last job in government was at the Cabinet Office, which is the department that supports directly the Office of the Prime Minister, where I handled, apart from professional matters, the handling of emergencies at national level and set up some national level systems for managing communication in a crisis. Now I've left the government service after 25 years and I work as a consultant in the private sector, doing many of the same things.
So we discussed many times about mad cow problem, the fuel crisis, Chernobyl, foot and mouth. Perhaps you could tell one or two things about these crises, or any crisis, the key things you have seen.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that over the years, certainly since about the mid-80s, when I first became involved in major emergencies, the thing that strikes me is things are getting more and more and more complex. But I can look back at, for example, the fire on Piper Alpha, which was a North Sea oil platform, which was a singular event. It was a terrible tragedy. It was a spectacular disaster, but it was contained and simple. We then, at that time, move on, for example, to the Great Storm of 1987, October 1987, which affected France as well as the UK. That had its complexities, but basically it was about the failure of the power line, of the power system. Again, though, a fairly simple affair, because what needed to happen was the power lines needed to be re-established, the generators needed to be brought up again to speed. We move on to my time at the police, with police in London, where the sinking of the Marchioness, which is a riverboat on the Thames, provided all sorts of problems. Here is a major river flowing through a major city. A huge 5,000-ton ship runs down a ship weighing less than 200 tons, with 180 people on board. And the complexity of that rescue was quite startling. Finding the right people who could operate in that very particular space in the river at night and working out where the people had gone who'd survived the accident was quite complex. We move on. Chernobyl, of course, happened back in the 1980s. Chernobyl had very widespread effects and perhaps gave us an idea of where complexity was beginning to break in. We still suffer the effects of Chernobyl in the UK. There are still areas in the UK where sheep cannot be slaughtered for human consumption because the grass is still radioactive. Began to see there an understanding of how complexity was creeping into these disasters, and because of our own systems of regulation and protection, we were creating problems as well as protection. Most recently, of course, with the, for example, 9/11, we have begun to see events which have extremely complex consequences. They have social consequences in the relationships between individuals and communities. They have economic consequences in the way that nations act towards each other. They have consequences for technology in the way that technology is having to deal with certain threats of terrorism, and to manage a complex environment such as airspace over a country in a way that can instantly move to remove a danger from the skies. So we have seen, in my view, an increasing amount of technology, an increasing amount of regulation, facing increasing threats, which means more and more complexity. Ultimately, for me, looking at, for example, BSE, mad cow disease, the foot and mouth outbreak here, for example, and the fuel protests here, which nearly brought the UK economy to its knees inside 4 days, we have seen the way in which highly optimised systems, which have been provided to sustain economic growth day by day, can be severely and instantly disrupted, and recovery from that has depended on people understanding how the complexity worked. But nobody knew how the complexity worked until the disaster struck, and the speed of recovery and the quality of recovery has depended upon the ability to map that complexity quickly and to make sure decision makers are focused on that complexity.
You always insist on the idea, do not prepare to fight the last war.
Never fight the last war. The last war may provide you with people who are experienced in handling decisions quickly. It may provide you with the right sort of room and the right sort of equipment. But the question is, what do you do with those things? Because we have seen over the last few years this enormous increase in complexity and an increasing understanding of our own limits in being able to forecast that complexity, we should now be beginning to learn that fighting the last war is a waste of time, and that what we need to be able to do is to identify what the real war is now. The fuel protest that we had in the United Kingdom, where a few hundred people managed to stop the flow of fuel to 27 million vehicles in this country, required us suddenly to understand how fuel was being delivered from the refineries to the petrol stations, how the minds of the people driving the tankers had been affected by their own industrial conditions. They were reluctant to face the picket lines. The very great passion behind the protesters themselves, and the ability of the public at large to be completely selfish, to ignore the fact that if they simply didn't queue up for petrol, the crisis would not have happened. Now, we learnt all those things in the 3 or 4 days it took to try and get this crisis under control. Nobody had thought about those things before then. The industry had thought about what happens if we lose supply. The government had thought about, well, how do we ration petrol if it's short? But nobody had put together social factors, economic factors, and the systems that run a modern economy.
So what did you do? Because it was completely out of...
Well, the truth is that for the first for the initial period, when the oil companies were telling government that a problem would arise, we didn't believe them. Government did not believe them. Then officials in government suddenly realised, yes, if there was a sudden shortage of petrol, certain effects might arise. But it took 2 or 3 days of the crisis itself for us to realise the one thing we needed was good common information. Around the decision-making table, arguments were taking place. Many of those arguments were based on misunderstandings. And until we realised that the need was to put in front of the decision makers agreed facts for decisions, we were lost. If you imagine the timescale, the problem is forecast on the Wednesday of a week. It takes till Friday to convince the officials at our Department of Industry that there will be a problem. They realise this and they seek emergency powers over the weekend, and that's in place. The protest starts, people queue for petrol, the petrol stations run dry, the tanker drivers will not leave the refineries over the next couple of days. It isn't really till Tuesday of the following week, when an enormous number of people cannot drive anymore, when a number of industries have come to a dead stop, that we realised that what was stopping effective decision making was the fact that we were arguing over words, over terms. So we created a team of oil industry officials, of policemen, of government officials, of trade union officials, and we said, go into that room, produce a document which is an agreed statement of facts. You bring those facts before the decision makers operate on that. We do not have the decision makers sitting around the table arguing about who did what and where. We have them only discussing decisions to be made on agreed facts, and that's the key. And that was when we began to get back into control of this situation. But it struck all of us then that we had never really realised before just what a barrier our own cultures, our own separate words, our own separate knowledge was to effective decision making in a complex society. And the first thing that we had to do when faced with a disruption of complexity was to make some agreed sense of it and then to operate on what we understood.
But it was only the UK. We imagined that in many countries at the same time would be terrible.
Well, there were in fact 21 similar protests happening across Europe.
Yes.
I don't think they bit as hard as in the UK because the UK compresses a very large number of people into a country half the size of France, and that has its own burden. It means that we have very highly optimised systems. Our just-in-time delivery systems are operating over small distances, and therefore they take big risks with disruption. Whereas in a country the size of, for instance, Canada, because the geography is so big, you have much more robust systems. They may be more expensive to run, but they provide a measure of robustness. In this country, we have national television and national newspapers, and therefore ideas spread through the culture very quickly indeed, and the picture on one television screen of a queue at a petrol station can make 100,000, 200,000 people get up, get into their cars and start queuing. So actually in a very large country where the geography disperses people and it breaks up communication, the culture, the attitudes and the messages travel differently to a very highly compressed, highly industrialised nation like the UK.
For the foot and mouth, the problem was perhaps to enlarge a little the scope and to see immediately that it was also a bit more a tourism problem and not only a...
Foot and mouth was a classic example of where we tried to solve one problem without realising there was a bigger problem somewhere else. The first problem arose because the learning had been done in 1967. The last major outbreak of foot and mouth had been in 1967. So all the planning had depended upon that. But in 1967 we didn't have the British motorway system, our auto route system. Sheep were not being moved across the country, completely across the country, within 18 or 20 hours. We didn't at that point have the European community subsidy system, so farmers were not actually doing what they do now sometimes, is they lend each other sheep to make up quotas. It's a quaint little phrase, bed and breakfasting sheep. Of course it's illegal, but it means that the animals get mixed up and they transmit disease. We didn't have this huge movement of animals across the country, which spread the disease very quickly. I've forgotten your point. Actually,
the tourism.
Oh, the tourism point,
yeah.
yes, of course. Well, and we focused initially, of course, on the foot and mouth disease, and the handling of the problem was all done within the Ministry of Agriculture, which had no interest in anything but the agricultural industry. Agriculture in the UK is 0.5% of gross domestic product. Inward tourism to the UK is 5% of gross domestic product. As we fought the disease, we shut the paths in the countryside, we made people believe that going into the countryside was a bad idea, we started to shut down tourism. We therefore caused massive economic damage in one industry, far greater damage through one industry than we did in the original industry where the animals were actually facing a disease threat. And that connection had not been seen before, and the connection did not come into the decision making again until it was quite late in the day, when suddenly it was realised that we could deal with the disease. Could we deal with the consequence of the disease? And again, there had been no map, and we hadn't mapped it. One reason we hadn't mapped it was that the original problem was contained within the Ministry of Agriculture for some time. It wasn't until it was broken out of the Ministry of Agriculture, it was put onto a central decision-making table that other ministries could take part in the decision-making and say, but this is our concern. It all being focused on one single industry. I have no doubt the next time we will not slaughter animals in that way again. We will vaccinate, we will do all sorts of things to avoid the wider economic damage. But the truth is, it was also, I mean, one has to realise this as well, I think, in the modern day. We learnt lessons about how a disease outbreak could disrupt not only agriculture, which is only 12% of the rural economy, but also tourism, which is probably about 80% of the rural economy. So have our enemies. I think we should be very, very aware of the fact that if we have learnt lessons about how easy it is to disrupt society, so have those who have malicious intent.
But again, we see the same thing. Where is the table where you put people discussing? And the idea, are the right people around the table? And we are always on this idea, who has the means, who has the lead, and finish.
I think that's a very important point. In our system, I think we have begun to learn properly the lesson that the lead is not necessarily best placed with the person who was dealing with the initial problem. There has to be somebody who is an independent chairman who can take a view across the entire problem. And indeed, with foot and mouth, that's what we did. The Defence Minister, whose only interest in the issue was the fact that we use some troops for slaughtering animals, we use some military expertise for running some of the operations. His only interest was that. He sat there and looked across the department's interests and chaired a meeting that took a broader view as we went on of the problems that were arising. We were locked into, by that time, solutions we could not avoid. But I think the need to have somebody who is disconnected from the issue, who says, I want to know what you think, who says, are there implications for health, are there implications for industry, are there implications for the education system, what will it do to daily life, what are the messages that are being sent to people overseas, what's the effect on business. Somebody has to be there to ask those questions, and it should be the chairman.
But today I think I see two problems. First, it is not in our culture.
Yeah.
Second, we don't have these bodies of people able to go immediately in these meetings and say, I don't see exactly the thing as you see it. And thirdly, perhaps, in a crisis, the normal tendency, immediate tendency, is to say, we are not here to ask for problems, but to solve them.
Yeah.
So please, no question.
Yeah, I think there are several problems there. The first one is the problem of people wishing to follow a script, and this is particularly true, I have to say, of men. If I have a crisis, I want to see at least 2 women around the table, because women are not afraid to challenge the norm. I mean, this is particularly true in British culture. You have a group of men around the table, they all go down the same road, and often it's a technological solution. Women go, what? Women are very happy to be dissonant, to ask the awkward question. And having somebody there like that is very valuable, because they do shake up the assumptions. Otherwise, a strong faction in the meeting will just take the whole thing away. The second thing is, you're right, there is always, particularly in government, a wish to say, can all this be handled by one single ministry? Because that's easy. It's a single unit, and what is more, the money all flows out of that unit. And we should never forget that in solving crises in government, who pays is very important. So we have to get people to break out of this thing and say, this is a big problem, it affects the whole economy, or it might do, we should immediately share what is going on. People who are squirrels, who keep it to themselves, should be treated like squirrels and shot, in my view. I mean, maybe putting it strongly, but I do think that those who believe they can solve everything are some of our biggest enemies. They may not know it, but they are. I think there is a real need to bring to bear on a problem this concept of assessment, which the military do the whole time. the military we call it battle damage assessment, where somebody is tasked with simply mapping what is going on, of providing that key set of facts. So here's the unequivocal set of facts. Here are the facts on which you must make decisions, and not to allow people around the table to introduce independently their own facts. They must bring their expertise, they must bring their opinions, but they should not be allowed to introduce facts which have not been put together with all the other facts, so that the decision makers have a particular and single point of reference. That's also a problem that those who wish us ill understand. If they can affect decision makers, they can disrupt the whole system. And what is the easiest way of disrupting an economy, a country? It is to affect the decision makers. I mean, that's now a major part of warfare. We have to protect our decision makers and say, here is a routine. Interestingly, you tackle complex problems by ruthlessly applying routines to it. You apply a routine for meeting, making decisions, actions and review. You apply a routine for gathering the facts and putting it in front of those decision makers. And you do it again and again and again. And you grind the complexity down. It's the only thing you have is the discipline of some sort of process which brings fresh, excellent knowledge to the table and forces decision makers to operate on it.
But I see two problems in two opposite directions. First, our leaders have been trained, selected, because they are the best to solve problems inside the box, and suddenly you ask them to tackle with something outside of the box.
Yes.
So they say, I'm not in charge. And on the other hand, the opposite side is probably it's your concept of granularity too. You have to go right to the soil, to the ground, and work with people and knit things. So at the same time, you need to have central capacities to analyze, to ask questions, to meet people, and at the same time, not to give orders but to work with people. So you have two contradictory.
There's a huge challenge there, and we found that in foot and mouth, where we had the central mechanism, we developed the central mechanism, we got it going pretty quickly, in fact. But on the ground, where the decisions had to be implemented, where people had to cooperate, we needed often to work one-to-one with people. Dealing with foot and mouth required individual farmers to make the most terrible decisions, to report sicknesses in their own herds, and to face the fact they might be losing their entire livelihood for that which they'd worked for years. It was no good government saying, oh, we've worked it out, we have a plan, here are the statistics which we could show, here are the mathematics, we can show exactly what we need to deal with this problem. Because we could show them the graph, we could show them how the disease would progress, but what does it mean to a man on the ground? There were occasions when we sent out one scientist to explain to one farmer what had to be done. So I'm afraid the catastrophe always has on its side simplicity and brutality. The solution to the catastrophe, the solution to the crisis, requires the converse. It requires detailed activity. It requires strategy to know what you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it, and it requires action deep in the grain, at a granular level, to make sure that people understand that what is happening is something that they want to take part in. We live in an age of mistrust, we live in an age of cynicism, we live in an age of independence and choice. People are listening less and less to government, and therefore if government or anybody else wants them to listen, it has to talk to them in their terms. Government can no longer, big business can no longer instruct people.
And I think it's quite different to say, I have to go to see this man, discuss with him, convince him, etc., listen to him. And the fashion we have is, if there is a problem, let's communicate. And we have a communique, we have media training, and I think it is not...
That's an illusion. It has its place. It obviously has its place for people to be media trained, for leaders at national level or regional level to speak to people. It's the only way they can do it. But in a crisis, you need leadership right the way through the chain, from the national level through to the local level. Because at the local level, that's where the impact will happen. And it is millions of local decisions by local people who are led by leaders locally that will solve the crisis often, not the decision at national level. You need the decision at national level to deploy those resources. You need patience at national level and understanding about what it will take to do it. But unless you're willing, I think, in this day and age, to operate at local level, both in the preparation of people for disaster and in the management of crisis, you cannot win. I think probably health crises are the most stark example of that, particularly where people will not listen to national level advice, they will talk to their local doctor. And therefore, when we faced national health threats, as we have in this country, recently there might have been a threat from terrorism, one of the key things we had to do was to brief every family doctor, every infection specialist in every hospital, every accident and emergency department, and say, this is what people will be asking you, this is what you can tell them, this is advice for you. And that level of granular action by government, I think, is now mandatory. Without that ability, we are lost. That, of course, argues for a lot more horizontal connections between organisations at local level as well as at national level. So if it is fatal to forget that if you have around the table all the ministers at local level, you will need around the table all of the people who represent the same sorts of activity.
I think we are facing a sort of race, because crises, complexity, ignorance is going up, and we don't have so much time, and the idea probably is to inject some positive energy in this system,
Yes.
to prevent mistrust to go up very rapidly, and people who don't know what to do, what to say, so there's a sort of race
that's
today.
right. I mean, one of the things I have written about is the need to create forums which discuss these issues before there is a crisis. It is impossible to explain complexity to any large group of people during a crisis. During a crisis, they are only largely concerned with the effect on themselves. They have little time or inclination to think about the bigger picture. I mean, look at the fuel crisis. People's concern was how do they fill their cars up, not whether or not they were blocking the roads or whether or not they were simply prolonging the crisis. Their need was to look after themselves and their family, and they took action. In a crisis, people want to take action. You therefore need to have structures and mechanisms that firstly build up trust between key people at local, regional and national level before a crisis, so they can talk effectively. And you need to be able to build up among the public an idea that there is something that they can do. So one of the key parts of handling a crisis is to give people something to do. I mean, in this country, it's a phrase known to the marketing men as agency. It's the way all good single-issue campaigns run. How do you get people to sign up to a single issue campaign? Why is Greenpeace so successful, for example? Because they focus on an issue and they give people agency, they give them something to do. If people believe they're taking part in an activity, they trust that activity. They feel they're contributing, they're happy to be doing something. People with time on their hands, frustration in their hearts and worries in their heads are dangerous people. They will do all sorts of things in the best and most well-meaning sense, but if they all do something different, then you merely prolong the crisis.
So if we have to push training of people in university to prepare them for this strange world we are going in, what sort of new approach to programs, to science you would promote in Oxford, in MIT, or anywhere?
I think that if I had one choice, it would be to make people think about networks. We live in a society that's constructed of networks at local, regional, national and transnational level. To distort Newton's theorem. Newton said that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. I think in the modern world, for every action there are multiple reactions across the networks, and every action that one takes, particularly in a crisis or in preparing for it or thinking about it, one should be thinking about the effect on all the people who might be involved. There needs to be an analysis of the stakeholders who has a stake in these things and of what might be disrupted. People need to build time Crises rob us of time. The thing that we can train people to do in university is to think about how they build time into the consideration of these things. One way is in preparation, in understanding how networks are built, and therefore being able to map them very quickly in a crisis. And secondly, during the crisis, to build time for decision makers by assembling those maps accurately and quickly and putting them in front of the decision maker. That gives the decision maker time to make proper decisions. Rhythm gives them time to make proper decisions. Without that time and without that appreciation of networks, I think we're probably lost.
And the idea of science is when you know, and now expertise is to deal with ignorance. And so don't say it is not your problem if you are confronted by ignorance. It's just the beginning of the work.
Ignorance is everybody's problem. And I think part of the job of those of us who understand these phenomena is to shake the complacency of those who don't, to show them how these things can affect them, to teach young people that there is nothing that they do in any field that does not have an effect somewhere else. It may be halfway across the world, it may be a local effect economically, it may be an effect on the mood of people, but all of those are equally important in the management of a crisis and in preparing for the management of a crisis.
And if we have to think of something international to be better prepared?
Oh, I think that that's one of the great challenges. If ministries are reluctant to ask each other's advice, governments are 10 times more reluctant to ask each other's advice. I think possibly it may be impossible to ask governments to cooperate as effectively as possible. I mean, look at the way we handle things through the European Union. In the best and most in the best way that anybody could consider, we want to help each other out, but the mechanisms we put in place almost become barriers in themselves. I think the exchange of knowledge between academic institutions, the exchange of knowledge between commercial organisations at working level and between governments at working level builds the understandings of the networks that we need. Do we need grand cooperative arrangements between governments? Possibly we do, and we're facing a huge problem in one country that it cannot handle. Actually, to make it work, we need understanding between people on the ground. So I would look at academic cooperation and understanding the science and sharing. I mean, we should be sharing information on these phenomena on a common basis with a common language onto a common database now. I think we should be looking very hard at what stops us exchanging information and using information from each other effectively. That's at the academic level, the scientific level. I think the same must be true for international companies, but they of course have learnt how to do that. There may be lessons to learn from international companies, particularly in financial markets, where information is being traded across the world, how they manage to make sure that what is said in Tokyo is understood in London, operated on in Washington, and provides benefits in Paris.
So, thank you. Let's go to work.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.